Because of the Great War, many nations were in economic and political turmoil. In the case of Russia, this brought about an iconic revolution, which saw the first attempt of creating a socialist state. In turn, this revolution produced war communism. War communism, in essence, was a response to the Russian Civil War between the Red and White armies. Although the actions stated in the policy itself began even before the Civil War. But before analyzing war communism and the Civil War, we must first answer the question of how did these events come to be? This question, I believe, is more important as war communism itself was an isolated policy. It was a cog in the machine of the Russian Revolution. The best way to analyze war communism is to look at the events that led up to it and the events that were caused because of it. The groundwork. In the late 1800s to early 1900s, Europe had an impressive rate of economic and technological progress due to the Industrial Revolution. Modernization took over Europe. With the increased accessibility to goods came a greater standard of living. In Russia, the daily pay of the agricultural worker rose, and the number of workdays per year for the peasantry saw a notable decrease between 1850 and 1902. Needless to say, modernization seemed to have been a great success, but it did bring with it a slew of problems. Namely, it led to a divide within the Russian population. Industrialization benefited the western areas of Russia more than the agrarian east. The industrial west was more accepting of new values, unlike the more traditional rural areas. Thus, this divide created unrest between the two factions. The population, that was approximately 80% rural, experienced unrest, peasant dissatisfaction, and the appearance of revolutionary movements and violence. This division laid the foundation for the later revolution. Destabilization. To add on to this growing disparity within the economic classes, a series of conflicts would further disrupt the lives of the Russians. In the Far East, we saw the occurrence of the Russo-Japanese War between 1904 to 1905. Russian government hoped that the conflict with a Southeast Asian country would ease class conflicts through the rallying power of nationalism that could be brought about by victory in a war. Unfortunately, their defeat led to protests, rebellions, and mutinies. A key moment in the spark of the revolution came on January 22, 1905, in an event that came to be known as Bloody Sunday. A demonstration was being held at the Winter Palace during this particular day, where a crowd of people attempted to appeal to the Tsar. They wanted the Tsar's assistance in appeasing their economic hardship. However, the security forces decided to fire upon the civilians, creating a bloody massacre. This event sparked many anti-monarchy sentiments and eventually gave rise to the Revolutionary Council in Petrograd called a Soviet. The next conflict that would further destabilize Russia and throw it into chaos was World War I. The Great War was long and bloody, and it took a heavy toll on Russia. The nation's railroad system was not able to simultaneously supply soldiers to the front and provide food for the countryside. The lack of food and the abundant losses caused massive discontent. On what will be known as the February Revolution, women marched through industrial areas demanding bread and asking the workers to join them. The monarchy ordered for the suppression of the demonstrators, but the guard would not comply. Thus, the Romanov dynasty came to an end. Two powers came about from the ashes of the Romanov monarchy: the provisional government, recognized as the official government by Russia's allies, and the Petrograd Soviet. The Petrograd Soviet were the citizen-elected councils in an area. The provisional government and the Menshevik-dominated Petrograd Soviet wanted to resume the war with Germany despite unpopular public opinion. The man that would later introduce war communism, Vladimir Lenin, suggested an armed uprisal at the capital. With the discontent regarding the Mensheviks and the provisional government, Bolshevik support grew into a majority. Eventually, This support allowed Lenin's plan to be put into action on November 7 in what was known as the October Revolution, thus beginning the rule of the Bolsheviks. War Communism. Soon after the October Revolution, Lenin was appointed to be the head of government. His main concern was the preservation of the revolution against foreign and domestic enemies. So when the Germans proposed the brutal Brest-Litovsk Treaty, Lenin accepted it. Thus, they lost a large amount of territory. Afterwards, Lenin made sweeping socialist reforms such as the annulment of private property and the prohibition of hired labor on land. As well, the right of all citizens to cultivate their own land was affirmed. Industry was also gradually nationalized. Although Lenin did not call these reforms war communism, they did echo its policies. Unfortunately, these reforms did not come unopposed. There were many disagreements between the Bolsheviks and their socialist rivals that argued over the direction of the revolution. There were even disagreements within the Bolshevik party itself. These disagreements eventually resulted into violent conflict between the Bolsheviks and the socialist revolutionaries that were supported by smaller socialist governments in East Russia. A civil war descended upon Russia. The Bolshevik Red Armies and the anti-Bolshevik White Armies fought for control. Effects of war communism. The problem with war communism itself was that it was too abrupt. It was designed to immediately convert Russia into a communist society. The seizure of private property, along with the government's inability to give sufficient compensation, disgruntled the populace. As well, Lenin underestimated the economic burden of a sudden transformation into communism. There was mass unemployment, disease, famine, and malnutrition due to this aggressive policy of war communism. After effects of war communism. After the Civil War, Lenin recognized that the sudden switch to communism was too rash. Therefore, he slightly reverted the economy towards a capitalist direction to ease the economic burden. An example of this is the replacement of the surplus food appropriation system. This system forced agricultural workers to give their produce to the state in order to distribute to the populace. This system did not work in practice as there were too many people and not enough food. Therefore, Russia introduced the tax-in-kind policy, which allowed the producers to sell some of their products, which gave them incentive in the form of profit. Going in the vein of this retreat to capitalism, Lenin introduced the new economic policy. This temporary shift was proposed as a necessary step in order to turn the country into a fully socialist state. The completion of the socialist state was never finished though, as only a few years later, Lenin met his end due to illness. Although war communism did provide hardship for the Russian people, it led to Lenin's enlightenment regarding the new economic policy. One could not help but wonder what would have happened if Lenin had lived and continued his policy. Perhaps Russia would have prospered as a socialist regime, or maybe the horrors of Stalin's rule would never have occurred. One thing is for certain, the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, Vladimir Lenin, and his policy of war communism have surely left their mark on history.